Most people agree on the fact that forests are key players in order to reach the climate goals. However, there's a deep disagreement on how the forest should be used or not be used. And we're here today to really try to get a grip of the discussion. And with us is Peter Holmgren, who used to be the director of the Center for International Forestry Research, and he also has many years of experience from the UN. So Peter, you've written several reports on this subject. Why is the discussion so overheated when it comes to the forest?
If you simplify it, you can say that some argue that the forest should be left standing because that's the best for the climate, while others, including me, argue that we need to manage the forest continuously and make use of the wood that comes out from it. That's when we get more benefit for the climate. Of course, reality is not either or, but it's a mix of the two. But I think we need to emphasize more that what we make from the forest is really what makes a difference for the climate. But we also need to realize that there is a structure here that we need to look carefully at when we talk about the forest. Because it is true that from the outset, the Climate Convention set up two goals. One, to reduce all the emissions from fossils, from cement and others. And two, to make sure that the sinks in our ecosystems is protected and enhanced. And of course, these two goals are both important. And when we talk about net zero, we're looking at a future where these two are balancing each other, so that the few remaining emissions that we may have in 2050 are balanced by a sink in the forest and in other ecosystems. That's what we call net zero. The forest and the forest-based sector contributes to both of the two goals, both to make sure that carbon is stored in the forest and to make sure that the emissions are reduced because we can use wood instead of fossil-based materials and fossil energy.
So that's a way of reframing the discussion?
I think it is a way to show that the forest and the forest-based sector is straddling these two goals, and we're contributing to both, and we need to be aware of that when we design policies. Around us we have the rest of the forest, which is still growing. So it's not that we are just taking wood out of the forest. The forest is also growing while we're doing it. So yes, we can eat the cake and have it, because we can harvest wood and we can make sure that the forest remains and grows even better.
If you look at the Swedish forestry, 85 million cubic meters of wood is harvested every year. And it's quite difficult for me as a layman to, understand that it's okay to take out that much wood and still be able, as you say, to eat the cake and have it too.
Yes, we harvest about 85 million cubic meters. At the same time, it grows by 120 million. So we're actually saving up a lot of wood in the forest and in the forest soil. Well, one argument goes that it's better if we don't harvest now because we need to save the carbon in the next 10 years. But the other argument is that, well, if we don't harvest now, one is that we disrupt the management system that we have and the circularity of that system. But two, and more importantly, if we don't deliver these wood-based products, we would have to use something else. And that something else would, to a large extent, be fossil-based. So we can't say that we're saving the climate by saving the forest. What we're doing is that we're creating more fossil emissions, and that's exactly what we don't want to do. I think a large part of the explanation is the structure that I mentioned from the Climate Change Convention, that we are looking at the actions in two different ways. One is to reduce emissions separately, and the other is to enhance the sinks separately. And the policies around the forest are mainly created around the second, and they don't see the combination of the two goals.
The EU now wants to lower the cap on harvesting to protect the forest as a coal sink. What will happen then to the climate from your perspective?
Well, what the EU wants is that we're enhancing the sink, increasing the sink. And in the short run, at least in Sweden, the only way we can do that is to reduce the harvest. So It's not EU telling us that we should reduce the harvest, but the consequence of what they're saying is that we need to reduce the harvest. What would then happen is that we would have less wood-based products on the market. Either those wood-based products would come from somewhere else, so they would be harvested somewhere else, or we would have to replace them with fossil-based alternatives. We would also store less carbon in products. So if you calculate the totals of this, then reducing the harvesting from our current levels in Sweden is very ineffective as a climate action. What we need to do is to look a bit broader and not discuss one environmental objective at a time. What is so interesting with the climate issue is that the climate benefits actually follows financial returns in the forest industry. This is a little different from most other industries, but I think this is a fundamental relationship that we need to understand and explain.
So why is it then that there are so many different positions when it comes to this particular question?
I think we should do a better work of explaining how the full bioeconomy works and why it is a circular activity that actually improves the forest where we've decided to manage it for wood production. There are many different views on the forest. Some want to save it for the sake of saving it. That's fine, and that's also what we do in many places. Others want to harvest it to make money out of the products. That's also fine if it's done in a sustainable way. And we need to accept that there are many different views on the forest. But when it comes to the climate, most of all, we need to explain that this is an activity that we really need to develop for the future. Net zero or carbon neutrality is a very prominent feature in policies and also in corporate goals. It means that we want to reduce our fossil emissions as much as possible, but whatever remains at the end, we need to compensate somewhere else, and that somewhere else often becomes the forest. So the forest carbon sink is set to compensate for fossil emissions elsewhere, and then we reach net zero. This also follows the structure of how the Climate Change Convention is set up. But this becomes a problem because it means that the forest is used to park carbon, when in reality what we need to do is to manage the forest, get wood out of it so that we can reduce the emissions. That was the first goal. So it becomes a contradiction. Net zero doesn't work for the forest. An interesting discussion would be to shift the focus of the value, the climate value of the forest, from the forest itself to the wood that it delivers. Yes, I think we need new business models that pays for the wood that is delivered, of course, from a sustainably managed forest. But since it is the wood that does the job here, it does the job both to reduce the emissions through a whole range of different products, and it does the job in making sure that there is income to the landowner so that we can see investments in the forest. Otherwise, we would get forests that are increasingly eaten by insects, burnt by fire, or felled by storms. And that will not be good for the climate at all.
So that's the job for the politicians then?
The politicians, or possibly the market. These boards will be eventually used in some kind of construction, where they will continue to store carbon for a very long time. This is important. It's the carbon storage in the products. But it's also only one of the climate benefits that we will see. The other one, which is actually even more important, is that if we use wood, it means that we are not using fossil-based materials. And that's what we call displacement or substitution. And that effect is very different from the storage, and both of them are very important.
Would you say that these things are commonly understood in the general debate?
There is a confusion sometimes in the debate, because we often talk about long-lived products. This is good, everybody thinks this is good, and we build houses in wood, this is good. But we seem to forget that the other effect is completely different, and even more important, that we are not using fossil-based materials. I hope that these are products that will be recognized, not only for their financial value, for bringing welfare to citizens in different forms, but also that this is a very big part of the solution when it comes to the climate.
And to make this a solution, would you say that something needs to be done concretely that's not being done today?
Again, I would say that what we need to realize is that the climate value doesn't stop in the forest. The climate value is even bigger when the wood has been turned into products. And that's a shift in perception that we need to achieve.
What happens to the rest of logs, climate-wise?
That's very key to the whole value chain of the forest-based sector. Of course, we can't make boards from the entire logs because they are round, as you say. They also have bark and they also have other parts that are not useful. So what happens is that we make use of every part of every log. What we can't make into boards, we make into pulp and paper. And what we can't even make into pulp and paper, we use for energy. And bioenergy is so important in Sweden. It's our biggest energy source. Most of that comes from the forest. It's the leftovers of our forest industry. In fact, more than 1/3 of our energy comes from bioenergy. And this is bigger than oil, it's bigger than nuclear, it's bigger than the hydropower, and it's renewable. So bioenergy is something that we need to pay more attention to, particularly these days when energy security has become a topic.
So, finally, what are the key conclusions for the forest and the forest industry regarding the climate?
It comes down to two things, really. One is, it's a circular business. We are working with nature and the carbon goes around and around. And the second is, the products from the forest industry replaces fossils and it replaces cement, which means we are getting down the emissions, which is really the big task for the climate.